In August of 1833, a physician from New Orleans rode upriver to a Louisiana sugar estate, expecting to save one sick planter. Instead, he found the cane being cut on schedule, the cook fires burning on time, and every order on the property coming from an enslaved man carrying the master's keys. For 11 days, Merrifield Estate appears to have functioned like a republic hidden inside slavery. Then the parish finally went looking, and everyone was gone. The estate sat in St. James Parish, on the east bank of the Mississippi, behind a levee road and a double row of live oaks that hid the house from the river. 620 acres of sugar land, cypress swamp, mule sheds, boiling rooms, and cabins laid out with the cold confidence of a world that believed it could organize human beings the same way it organized cane rows. Its owner was a planter named Etienne Vale, not the richest man on the river, but old enough in family name to be treated as if authority still clung to him by inheritance alone. By the summer of 1833, that authority was fraying. If not for 3 surviving fragments, Merrifield would probably have dissolved into one more silence in the archive. The first was a narrow ledger book kept by Dr. Lucien Fournier, the physician summoned to the estate on August 7th. The second was a packet of unsent letters written by Adrienne Mercier, a cousin of Vale's wife, who came for a short family visit and never mailed what she saw. And the third was a deposition from a neighboring sugar factor named Caleb Monroe, given during a private parish inquiry that was never meant for publication. Taken separately, the fragments feel strange. Read together, they suggest something far more dangerous. They suggest that for 11 days in August, the people enslaved at Merrifield did not merely resist the system around them, they ran the plantation without it. Dr. Fournier wrote that he arrived just before sunset and was met not by the overseer, not by a white relative, but by a black man in his early 30s, who introduced himself simply as Daniel. The doctor noted the detail almost defensively, as though he understood at once that he was looking at something he had no language for. Daniel wore a sweat-darkened linen shirt, rough trousers, and a ring of keys at his side. He spoke quietly, clearly, like a man informing another adult how matters would proceed. "Monsieur Vale is alive," he told the doctor. "He has been in and out of sense for 2 days. You will come now." The words are simple. The structure of them is not. Adrienne Mercier's letters suggest Daniel had been occupying a strange position in the house long before the illness. Etienne asks for him before he asks for his overseer, she wrote. He keeps the storeroom keys, answers questions no servant should answer, and no one corrects him. In another letter, Adrienne described a dinner where Etienne spoke carelessly about expanding production on the North Parcel and taking a new loan against his labor force. "The room did not erupt," she wrote. "That is what unsettled me. 3 of the house servants looked at one another only once, and then lowered their eyes as if some decision had already been made elsewhere." By the first week of August, Etienne Vale was suffering headaches, tremors, stomach distress, and spells of confusion. His wife, Sabine, began preparing her own meals apart from the kitchen. On the evening of August 6th, Vale collapsed during supper with half-chewed food still in his mouth. Sabine wanted a doctor sent for immediately. Daniel told her they would send before dawn. What frightened Adrienne was not that Daniel contradicted the mistress of the house. It was that everyone in the room accepted it. That night, Adrienne says she could not open her bedroom door from the inside. She heard footsteps in the hall, then out in the yard, then farther off toward the boiling house and the cabins. No screaming, no gunfire, no drunken confusion, only movement, purposeful, repeated, disciplined movement, as if the whole estate had shifted into some prearranged pattern. Dr. Fournier stepped into that pattern the next evening. He found Etienne Vale upstairs, feverish and weak, though not delirious enough to explain what surrounded him. Two black women attended him with calm precision, cooling his head, changing cloths, measuring broth, deciding what he would swallow and when. The doctor noticed something else. There were no white relatives in the house. He asked where Sabine and her small son had gone. Daniel said they were resting in a rear cottage, away from the heat and excitement. When he asked for the overseer, a man named Paul Givens, Daniel said Givens had ridden to the parish road for supplies and had not yet returned. According to Caleb Monroe's later deposition, that was impossible. Monroe stated that Givens had already been dead for at least 2 days. His body eventually recovered from a drainage trench after heavy rain collapsed the soil above it. No public death notice, no coroner's statement. The parish record for that week simply leaves the line blank. The doctor's first instinct was to leave after stabilizing his patient. Daniel prevented that without ever raising his voice. Fournier found his horse moved from the front paddock to a distant enclosure beyond the mill yard. When he protested, Daniel apologized for the inconvenience and explained that the river road was unsafe after dark, that Monsieur Vale's condition remained uncertain, and that the doctor's continued presence was necessary. Necessary to whom? The journal never directly asks. By morning, the estate was functioning in a manner Fournier describes with almost superstitious unease. Cane crews went out. Rations were prepared. Livestock was watered. Children were kept close to the cabins. Older people were seated in the shade near the wash yard. But no whip cracked. No overseer crossed the rows. Orders passed from Daniel to a cluster of men and women who seemed already to know where each order belonged. The doctor wrote, "The labor is not free, yet the fear that usually animates such places is absent. I do not know what replaces it. Obligation, perhaps, or agreement." That line matters, because Merrifield did not appear to descend into chaos when formal white authority collapsed. It appeared to reveal another form of order that had been concealed underneath the official one all along. Adrian's letters make that seem less impossible. She noticed that the same people who served the table also tracked inventories, that the women in the dairy controlled access to salt and lamp oil, that an elderly cooper named Moses was consulted before repairs were made to the sugar carts, that Daniel met twice in 1 week with a boatman from the river landing after everyone else had gone to sleep. "There is management here that does not pass through the master's study," she wrote. "It passes around it." On August 9th, Fournier tried again to leave. Daniel asked him to walk first. He was led beyond the rear kitchen garden, past the laundry yard, to a cleared patch behind the disused indigo shed where 14 people stood in a loose circle. Some were field hands, some house servants. One an older woman with a shawl pinned tight despite the heat. Another a broad-shouldered carpenter with a scar along his jaw. They fell silent when the doctor arrived, not from panic, but because he was a variable being assessed. That night, for the first time, Daniel spoke plainly enough for the journal to turn from observation into fear. "You believe this place survives by one man's will," he told the doctor. "It survives because 100 people wake before daylight and make it survive. We have simply stopped pretending otherwise." Fournier wrote that he did not answer. He also did not sleep. The darkest stretch begins on August 11th. A mounted patrol farther downriver had started asking why no sugar invoices had left Merrifield for several days. A merchant had been turned away at the gate with a story about fever. A priest expected for a child's instruction never arrived because someone met him on the levee road and persuaded him the household was under quarantine. In other words, the bubble was thinning. That evening, Daniel permitted Fournier into a meeting in the old counting room beside the warehouse. The doctor expected whispers, perhaps a conspiracy. What he found instead was procedure. A rough table, candle stubs, open ledgers, cornmeal tallies, mule harness inventories. A list of names grouped by age, trade, kinship, and river readiness. One column marked those who could row. Another marked those who could sew, nurse, mend sails, speak French, read scripture, keep numbers, fire a kiln, treat fever, build shelving, teach letters. This was not a mob improvising escape. It was a community auditing itself for survival. Fournier wrote that Daniel sat at the head of the table, but not as a tyrant. People interrupted him, corrected him, proposed changes to routes and provisions. One woman argued that the older people should leave first because they would slow any later departure under pursuit. A cooper objected that the children should be dispersed among family groups rather than packed by age. A teenage boy, who had likely never been permitted to speak in any white person's hearing, recommended taking iron tools instead of silver because iron could be remade into hinges, nails, and blades. The doctor's hand shook so badly in the journal that the ink feathers through the page. He had not been brought into a rebellion. He had been brought into a government. At the edge of the table sat Etienne Vale's account books, opened to debts that explained more than any sermon could. Loans against land, loans against next year's crop, emergency notes against machinery, and then, in colder handwriting, valuations beside human names. Men, women, children, mothers with nursing infants, carpenters, mill hands, a girl not yet 10 years old, all converted into collateral against ruin. Daniel saw the doctor reading, and did not stop him. That is the moment the story changes, because the impossible thing at Merrifield was not only that the enslaved had organized themselves, it was that they had identified the master's weakest point with perfect clarity. Etienne Vale was drowning, and if he went under, he planned to drag 94 other lives into separate sails, separate coffles, separate states, separate graves. Later fragments suggest Daniel offered him another bargain. We do not know exactly when. We do not know whether it began as threat, persuasion, confession, or arithmetic. But the outline appears again and again. Sign the papers. Liquidate nothing. Disappear the estate before the creditors arrive. Leave as diminished people rather than remain as master and property. Or hold to the old order and watch the sheriff, the auction block, and the debt ledger do their work. It is one thing to imagine revolt against a man. It is another to imagine negotiating against the failure of an entire economy. On August 12th, Fournier was taken upstairs to examine Vale. The planter was conscious enough now to understand where he was and perhaps what had happened. The doctor expected rage. Instead, he found exhaustion so deep it read almost as surrender. Vale asked for water. Daniel handed it to him. There is a line in the journal, half blotted by the doctor's hand, that has haunted every later reading of the case. Monsieur Vale did not command him. He thanked him. If that line is true, then the center of Merrifield had already shifted beyond recovery. The next day brought the real deadline. A patrol would come within 48 hours, perhaps sooner. The road could not remain quiet. The doctor wrote that Daniel asked him whether he intended to live. Fournier, stunned, answered that he did. Daniel replied, "If the parish bursts this place open before we move, they will call it insurrection, and everyone here will die under that word." No melodrama, no speechifying, just the brutal precision of naming what the outside world would do with the story. The journal's final complete pages describe an operation moving under lantern light, food packed into flour sacks, iron tools wrapped in cloth, medical supplies divided into packets, a writing box removed from Vale's study, children soothed awake and dressed without explanation. Sabine Vale and her son brought quietly from the rear cottage where, contrary to Daniel's earlier lie, they had been kept not in comfort, but in guarded seclusion. Sabine is described as pale, alert, and no longer surprised by anything. Adrienne Mercier disappears from the written record here. Either she refused the arrangement and was sent away early under escort, or she went with them and later destroyed any account that could expose the root. There is no reliable answer. There is, however, one final back cover note in Fournier's ledger that changes the entire moral frame of the case. The doctor says Daniel privately told him to preserve the account, but hide it until enough of the others have crossed beyond reach. When Fournier asked what others, Daniel reportedly smiled and said, "You think this river only carries sugar?" If genuine, that line suggests Merrifield may not have been an isolated miracle. It may have been one successful node in something larger. Caleb Monroe testified that on August 18th, he entered Merrifield with 2 other men after repeated silence from the estate had become impossible to ignore. They broke the chain at the gate, rode to the house, and found it empty. Not looted, not burned, not blood-soaked. Empty. Plates left on a sideboard. One child's wooden cup on the porch. A ledger open in the study. A blanket folded at the foot of a bed. The cabins vacated with the haste of necessity, but not the confusion of panic. The most disturbing discovery stood behind the smokehouse. 3 freshly filled pits. The men assumed they had found graves. When the ground was opened later under private supervision, the pits contained no bodies. Only stripped clothing, plantation ledgers, broken iron restraints, account pages, 2 family Bibles, and bundles of personal objects wrapped in cloth, as if an entire way of life had been buried on purpose. Not the dead. The role they were leaving behind. Within days, officials from the parish and commercial families from New Orleans imposed an explanation. Etienne Vale had liquidated his position and relocated with his household and labor force to a new venture in Veracruz. A paper solution to a public nightmare. Creditors appeased, family honor shielded, no open inquiry, no large-scale search. Merrifield transferred within 6 weeks to a cousin by marriage, and by the next harvest, the cane was growing again, as though the earth itself had signed a non-disclosure agreement. But fragments survived. An 1841 notarial register in Cap Haitien records the purchase of communal land by a representative named Daniel Freeman, and a second signer identified only as E. Vale. A weather-damaged covenant discovered in a burned meeting house outside Jacmel in 1903 opens with a sentence so startling it feels almost modern. No person shall stand as property beneath another, and each household shall answer for the freedom of all. The document bears 94 marks, exactly the number listed in Merrifield's last intact slave schedule. In 1872, a missionary in Nova Scotia interviewed an elderly black carpenter who claimed his people had once come from a river country, where the cane cut your hands and the books counted your children. Asked how they escaped, he answered, "We did not run like hunted things. We left after the numbers changed." That answer may be the closest we ever come to Daniel's real strategy. Not fury alone. Not mercy alone. Leverage. Take a plantation already collapsing under debt. Understand every hidden skill required to make it run. Build trust horizontally, or the institution builds fear vertically. Wait until the master's weakness becomes undeniable. Then force a choice so absolute that the old language of power breaks under it. Join the crossing, or be ruined by the world you built. There is one more reason Merrifield unsettles the historical imagination. Violence, however horrifying, fits the archive's expectations. Revolt followed by punishment. Resistance followed by repression. Those are stories the system knew how to narrate, and therefore how to contain. But Merrifield points towards something much more dangerous. A negotiated undoing. Not innocence, not peace in any sentimental sense. The overseer was dead. The doctor was held against his will. Fear moved through every room. But beneath that fear was another proposition entirely, that the plantation order could be made to serve the exit of the people it had been built to cage. That possibility would have terrified the planter class more than a bloodbath, because blood can justify harsher chains. Success can inspire imitation. In the 20th century, long after the house was gone and the river had eaten parts of the old road, laborers digging drainage for a new subdivision reported finding hand-forged nails twisted around fragments of chain, bits of scorched ledger paper, and a brass key filed from plantation hardware into a new shape. One side, barely visible beneath corrosion, were the words, "For the next door." Maybe that inscription was added later. Maybe it belonged to another story entirely. But Merrifield hardly needs embellishment. For 11 days in August of 1833, on a Louisiana sugar estate built to convert human life into profit, another order seems to have existed. A doctor saw it and feared it. A guest sensed it before she had words for it. A neighboring factor helped bury it under testimony nobody was supposed to read. And somewhere beyond the reach of river patrols and parish ledgers, a group of people may have carried that brief, impossible order into a place where it could survive longer than 11 days. That is what makes the case so difficult to forget. Not only that the people of Merrifield may have freed themselves, but that they may have done it by proving the world around them was weaker, more negotiable, and more cowardly than it claimed to be. The old order liked to speak as if it were permanent, as if the cane, the columns, the account books, the auction blocks, the names signed in iron gall ink were all part of the natural architecture of reality. Merrifield suggests otherwise. It suggests that beneath every system of domination, there are people mapping its hinges. It suggests that some of them learn exactly which ledger, which road, which illness, which debt, which silence, and which moment can open the locked door. And most unsettling of all, it suggests that this may not have happened only once. Perhaps that is why the record was thinned, mislabeled, scattered, and buried. Not because nothing happened there, but because something did. Something disciplined, something transferable, something that hinted the enslaved were not merely enduring the plantation world or dreaming beyond it. They were studying how to unmake it from within. The river keeps no minutes. The cane fields sign no affidavits. But for a brief span in the summer of 1833, if the fragments are read honestly, Merrifield was not a plantation in the usual sense at all. It was a council. It was a departure plan. It was a test of whether human beings could step out of a murderous hierarchy without carrying its logic intact into the next world. And somewhere in the river mist, if the surviving traces tell true, 94 people answered yes.